Hello and welcome to another episode of Drive with Me. Today, I actually wanted to talk about masculinity and patriotism and how those intertwine with politics in modern America. So, unless you're interested in talking about American politics and culture, this may not be for you. However, if that sort of topic interests you, I think that's what I'm going to be touching on today. So, I have lately been watching several videos by the actor Matthew McConaughey, and one of the videos that actually stood out to me was a good man is not necessarily a nice guy, or something to that effect. A nice guy is not a good man, or something like that, right? I don't remember the specific title, but that was the gist of it. And he made some really good points, and they were things that I legitimately have already believed, and yet he put it and said it in a rather eloquent way that I actually really appreciate. So the another influence that I've had recently and kind of my thoughts that led to this video is I believe his name is Chris Newman, and he does TikTok and YouTube shorts and that and videos and so on. He's I believe a chicken and chicken farmer. I believe he raises cattle and sheep and some other stuff, or at least he and his partners do. I believe it's called the Blackbird Co-op, and they're based out of Virginia. And anyway, he does a lot of it is just about his chickens and farming and stuff like that, right? And the nature of what it means to be a first generation farmer. He even has his own book and so on. But he does get into like cultural and political stuff from time to time, and I often really enjoy those videos. And he also hit on one that I watched recently about Republican men not having a monopoly on masculinity. And so those together have kind of been fermenting in my mind a bit. And so I wanted to give my thoughts on it. So, for a little bit of background about myself, I am what many people consider a pretty masculine dude, right? I am also not a Republican. I'm not a proud Democrat, but I do tend to lean more progressive. And I was raised in a law enforcement and military family with some pretty traditional gender roles and old school masculine values, and grew up fishing and doing a little bit of hunting. Actually, not a whole lot of that, but I did some, and definitely shooting guns. My God, I think I had one in my hands by the age of 5 at the latest. And if you're talking about BB guns and stuff, probably earlier than that. So it's I wouldn't say that I come from like a soft progressive family. However, as I grew up with people that really were very, very like pro Reagan and couldn't stand Clinton, and Bush was doing the right thing in the Middle East, and then Obama was terrible and probably wasn't actually from her anyway, and now we're just absolutely of avid Trump supporters by and large. I find myself to have drifted away from that viewpoint pretty heavily. And I believe that Trump is just one of many in a class of people, collectively and simply known generally as billionaires, but it's a lot more complex than that, that actively take advantage of a majority of the American people, and they give very little back. In fact, that wealth has slowly been siphoning to the top at an ever faster rate over the last half century or so, notably since the 1980s. So I don't have a huge amount of respect for men just because they have money. And I think that's led to me being perceived as progressive. And in some cases, just being a student of history has led to some calling me woke, even though I'm a white dude that honestly doesn't touch on the subject of race and ethnicity particularly often. I tend to focus more on history and economics and technology and so on. However, it seems like woke has been misconstrued as just being aware that there are societal issues and inequalities and inequities that have led to certain people having less of an advantage than others. And if that's what woke is, then we should all be woke, because that is all that I'm advocating for, is realizing there's some stuff that white men have had access to, myself included, that many women have not had access to, and that many black folks have been systematically shut out of. And this is just objective fact. This isn't debated. This is reality. If you go back to even the 1960s, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, right, doesn't mean everything magically became equal then. And historically, certain groups have had much greater issues and many more obstacles, if they've been able to overcome them at all, getting access to farmland and to homes that they own and so on, starting businesses that aren't then turn around and like burn down if they're actually doing well, which is also a historical reality if you're not white. So that kind of reality is just reality. And so if we are woke for understanding that, then I guess I fall into that category, but then I kind of weep for our nation for not understanding its own history better. So that's part of what I wanted to speak about. Is I completely agree with Chris Newman of the Blackbird Co-op and Matthew McConaughey. One, conservative men by no means have a monopoly on masculinity. In fact, some of the best men that I've met that have largely influenced and ended up being indirect mentors to myself and led me down a different path than many of my own family members were rather, I would say, independent to, in some respects, leaning progressives themselves, and were often quite woke. And several of them were men of color, and in fact men that had been through a lot more than I have been, and introduced me to a way of thinking that I had been protected from because I was a middle to upper middle class Northern European descended white male, right? And I've noticed a lot of white men like myself don't really take a lot of it into account, and it kind of bothers me, honestly, because I think we can do better. And I think we're only not doing better because we haven't been forced to, collectively. Individually, some of us make the decision to try to be better. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I'm sure there are plenty of really screwed up things I still am inclined to believe, and biases I still have that I'm not even consciously aware of. And I'm not claiming to be a particularly good person, right? When all is said and done, it also doesn't bother me to acknowledge that I'm sure I have quite a bit of improvement to make, because I've been kind of forcing myself as much as I can to look in the mirror and make those realizations over time, especially as I've become a therapist and finish up a graduate degree and been working in a field wherein I ask people to do the same, right? And so nice guys, as is often defined, particularly by men themselves, do not inherently make good men. And there was a story that stood out to me. I was watching a show called something to the effect of Worst Neighbors Ever with my wife. And there was the story of this really nice guy named, I believe it was Miles, and his family. They were from the Oakland area in California. And there was a neighbor who he was close with. I believe his name was JT. And they were both darker skinned individuals. So there was nothing, as far as I'm aware, that was like racially motivating any of this or anything like that. And JT's family got effectively evicted because the owners that they were of the home that they were renting from passed away, and the children sold off the home as part of the estate sale. And so they got kicked out of the home, and this JT individual started using substances, or got worse in it, whatever it was, and kept coming around the home, and then wound up blaming the neighbors for some reason, in particular this Miles gentleman that had, I believe he and his wife had two or three, somewhere between 2 and 4 children. And she was pregnant at the time a lot of this was going on, his wife, that is, and there was just this escalating conflict. It really stressed him out. JT started throwing rocks and bricks through their windows, and I believe they said it was something like 23 times they broke windows. Got to the point that guys that were coming out to install and repair them were asking them, "Are you sure you want to do this? I'm just going to be back here, soon to fix another one." And yet, the entire time that I'm watching this, I'm thinking, maybe it's just white privilege, white male privilege, but frankly, I don't care what color the dude is. He could be a white meth head. He would not be alive to have made it that far. That's what I'm thinking in my head. I'm like, maybe I just grew up in the wrong kind of family to screw with, but after, honestly, time one, you get okay, that was a dumb decision, a bad night, you got really wasted, and you made a stupid decision. Round two, you're threatening my family and my children. I'm sorry, buddy. I don't care if you're standing, because he was often standing out in the middle of the street that was public access. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'll drag your ass back towards my property if I need to. I don't care. I'm like, I live in a stand your ground state, which I don't even always agree with, but it doesn't matter. The bottom line is, if you're threatening my family and my young children, you are going to suffer for that poor decision. You get at what most one warning. And that's kind of where I agree with Matthew McConaughey, that a nice guy does not always equal a good man, because as the character Gus says in Breaking Bad, that I largely agreed with, in the show Breaking Bad, that is, what does a man do? He provides. He provides material goods to make sure that his family is taken care of, and he provides safety and security for his family. And if you were allowing somebody to terrorize your home and your family and quite literally traumatize your children, you're not providing the security you need to. And I'm not trying to badmouth this Miles character. I think he was really trying to do the right thing. He was relying on law enforcement, relying on neighbors to keep an eye out, and trying to talk some sense into JT. But the guy ended up shot and killed by this JT character. I believe they said he was shot 10 times. And then the family subsequently sued the city and county of Alameda in Northern California, in the Bay Area there, and won. So I was like, it's like $1.5 million or something, like $2 million, somewhere in there in total, from those lawsuits, because of the negligence of law enforcement, right? And that, as far as I'm concerned, they deserve that and probably more, because Miles was incredibly patient, and he literally paid with his life, and now his daughters, his children, are going to grow up without him. His wife has to handle that without him. Everything that comes with parenting. And as a parent of young children, I know how stressful it is with two people. I know how hard it is to keep a family and a household together with two people. Doing it by yourself sucks. I can only imagine, right? It sounds awful. And this poor lady has to do it because of some maladjusted gentleman. I'm trying to be real, gentle about how I describe this guy here, but a dude with problems that did not get handled. And that would be my response. I get okay, so at first you give the system a chance. You try to see if he'll be arrested, if they'll actually handle it, if they'll get him into a rehab, if they'll help him. But the reality is, in America, our system is largely broken and tons of people fall through the cracks. You start threatening family, you start threatening home, where we sleep and where we have our property and so on, where we stay, where our children are growing up, and you start throwing stuff through the windows and you start making overt threats. JT, this character, started threatening to burn their house down. Eventually the family boarded up their windows and so on. And Miles was still trying to be patient and work through it with this dude, and it led him to the point of actually being killed. And I'm sorry, but the reality is, a good, truly good man, one that had the right mindset, would have put JT down a long time ago, because this went on for months, okay? And I'm not ashamed at all to say that. That dude needed to be handled. And that is where I think, even as a progressive man, right, it doesn't mean that as a progressive or as someone who's quote-unquote woke, it doesn't mean we don't understand reality. In fact, if anything, I'd argue that a lot of more progressive-leaning men understand history and culture and the nature of reality outside of your own little bubble better than most, in my not-so-humble experience. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with a lot of this. So just because one is quote-unquote nice does not give you an entitlement to women. Just because you are paying for things does not mean you are entitled in any way, shape, or form to a woman or her body. Unfortunately, there's a whole separate conversation there about the nature of OnlyFans culture and so on that I have some thoughts on, but I'm not going to touch on in this video. But a lot of what I hear as issues with masculinity from men, right? That women don't appreciate a good man. I'm actually, many of the truly good men, they're married pretty early on, frankly, like I was, right? We often tend to attract women to ourselves just by being truly decent guys, but also knowing what we want. I wasn't particularly nice about it. Honestly, I took my wife from another man that she had previously been dating and actually engaged to. They were having issues. She made it clear she was interested in me. I decided I wanted her, and I didn't give a fuck whether or not they were going to be able to work it out. I was like, this is what I want, and I took it, and we've been married for about 9 years now. So that's kind of another example, and honestly, I don't regret it at all. Because again, just because you are a nice guy does not mean life owes you anything. And often being a good man requires you forsaking some of these quote unquote nice guy principles. It doesn't mean you truly go out of your way to hurt people or what have you, but you protect your own interests. You protect your own, you protect your family. You make sure you, when you are interested in a woman, you don't make any bones about it. You let her know. And if she's not interested, then you back the hell off. Right? Like this pressuring and wearing women down thing is nonsense also. And in fact, we really as men should, in my not so humble opinion, have the self-confidence and self-value, self-esteem to feel like, well, if she's not interested, if she either can change her mind later and let me know and then I'll think about it and we'll talk about it then, or it's not really worth my time, right? Like there's other proverbial fish in the sea. And I think that's how all of us should be thinking about this, men and women. That's not even a masculinity thing specifically. That's just this is how we live our best life and don't get hung up on people that are bad for us, right? If they're not putting in 50-50 into the relationship, if they're not willing to pursue us, at least close to the level that we're pursuing them at some point in the relationship, it's not a good relationship to be in. So to be truly masculine does not mean you have to be a Trump supporter or listen to Andrew Tate or even Joe Rogan, right? Like honestly, I don't have the same issue with Joe Rogan that a lot of progressives seem to. I think the guy has said some things, plenty of things that I disagree with, but he's also turned around and he's changed his position on different things. And I think he talks to a lot of people and doesn't claim to be the smartest guy in the room, and takes a lot in and is willing to admit when he believes that he's wrong and change his opinion. I respect the hell out of that, honestly. I think that's how we should be as men. That those that are really stubborn and quote unquote stick to their guns and refuse to ever acknowledge that they're wrong are some of the more dangerous men on the planet, in all honesty, especially when that gets tied in with religion. And again, I have no issue with religion. I grew up in the church as an evangelical, so I do not have a problem with those that follow Christ or Islam, the word of Muhammad, or what have you, right? Doesn't really matter to me what your religious principles are. But when you use them to hurt other people, now we have a problem. So that is where I come from in that regard, because those that will state things like, well, homosexuality is an abomination, like so is eating shellfish, according to Leviticus, which is exactly where you got that whole homosexuality is an abomination thing that comes from Levitical law in the Old Testament of the Bible, right? But so do a lot of other really dumb things. Like if you wear clothing of mixed thread type, right? Like almost all modern clothing is a mixed variety. There's different percentages of different types of thread. Apparently, we should all be severely punished. If you, as a child, even of an adult child of your parents, you disobey your parents, they're entitled to provide some pretty severe punishment to you. If you grow like a garden with crops next to it, different types of crops next to each other, you can also be severely punished, and so on. Levitical law is a ridiculous standard to apply to anything. What matters is, in my opinion, a far more humanist or pro-human perspective. What is good for us collectively? What is good for society? What is harming people and what is not? And then you go from there, right? And is homosexuality harming people? Not other people. Those that choose to engage in it, sure. And if you're then talking about, well, they often have a higher rate of dating pedophiles or whatever, which one is largely propagandic nonsense. But even if that's the case, then you handle that, right? Because there are plenty of straight, heterosexual pedophiles as well. In fact, we're having a lot of issues with them also being billionaires, as it turns out, and going to places like Epstein Island. So that's a whole separate issue that I'm not going to touch on much in this video either. But the idea that one's personal decisions or sexual orientation or even sexual expression, like for those that are trans, impacts people at large is pretty much nonsense. In fact, the trans issue has gotten so petty, we're literally just talking about whether or not they should be allowed to, which bathroom they're allowed to use and whether or not they should play in sports that align with their preferred gender and so on, which honestly feels just really petty and low. Like, this is what American politics has gotten to. Like, can we not just agree, set a standard for certain things and kind of leave it there? Like, this is kind of getting ridiculous. And some conservatives would say the same, but I mean, like, have a standard in regards to what is sportsmanlike conduct, what is fair. Maybe we have mixed teams, because there are going to be things, even like if you're playing soccer or baseball, there are going to be things that certain women are better at than males are, right? And that's okay, right? The reality is, just like traditional gender roles would assert, which I often like and have largely set up in my own household, right? As we need both. We need men and women. We need males and females, masculinity and femininity, and we need a range of it to be a truly healthy family and society and nation, right? And so trying to act like trans people are destroying that is kind of a ridiculous concept as far as I'm concerned. You can have certain issues with certain specific things, like sure, if you have a biological male that is competing in female sports, does that give them an unfair advantage? Sure. But do I feel really strongly about it? No, I don't. That's a separate issue that I think we have many more important things to deal with than that. So that's another example of just because one tends to lean progressive doesn't mean we're all like dying on this hill, right? Or because we generally lean towards a more woke view of history and culture and American reality doesn't mean that we're necessarily like um, of an ultra liberal or far left stance. So anyway, take everything with a grain of salt. Realize that if somebody is trying to sell you that one group of people is all this or all that, good or evil or bad or what have you, it's probably nonsense, because the reality is we're all individuals and we all have nuance, right? Masculinity is definitely not owned by the right, nor is it owned by the left. There's a whole range and spectrum of it. And being a good man does not inherently mean that you are a nice guy. And just because you are a nice guy does not mean you are a good man or that you are entitled to anything. One of the many reasons why I would argue being a nice guy is honestly not a particularly great way to go. So that was pretty much what I had today. Some of what I said will probably be controversial to some folks out there, but nonetheless, that's where I stand on a lot of this. So if you made it this far, I appreciate you doing so. Feel free to hit the like button if you did. And if you want to hear more about politics, economics, culture, technology, etc., then please stick around because I'll be talking more about it. Y'all have a good one.